She was 17 years old. She was standing alone in the Nevada desert at midnight, holding a rifle worth more than most people's cars, in wind cold enough to crack bone. And the men surrounding her, decorated veterans, combat-hardened operators with decades of war stitched into their skin, were laughing. They thought this was a joke. They thought she was a joke. By 0200 hours, not one of them would make a sound. By 0400, they would watch her do something that shouldn't be possible. And every single one of them would understand, in the hollow silence after the last shot, that they had never truly known what a weapon looked like until tonight. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The heater in the duty shack had been broken since Thanksgiving. Nobody had fixed it because nobody expected to be here over Christmas. That was the understanding. Unofficial, unwritten, but universally held, between the 12 operators assigned to the night rotation at Raven Ridge Proving Grounds. You pull duty in November. You pull duty in January. You do not pull duty on Christmas Eve unless someone up the chain has either made a catastrophic scheduling error or genuinely despises you. Chief Warrant Officer Mason Cole was beginning to suspect it was the latter. He sat at the steel desk in the duty shack with a cold mug of coffee in his hand, watching condensation crawl down the inside of the single-pane window. Outside, the test range stretched into total darkness, a half-mile of frozen hardpan interrupted by steel silhouette targets, a concrete observation bunker, and a generator tower someone had wrapped in cheap holiday lights 2 weeks ago as a joke. The lights still blinked. Green, red, white. Green, red, white. On and off in no particular rhythm, blinking against the black Nevada sky like a distress signal nobody had answered. From the old speaker mounted above the door, the one with the cracked housing and the perpetual low-frequency hiss, a Christmas song played. Something classic. Something cheerful. The recording was so degraded by years of desert heat and cold that the melody kept dropping out entirely, leaving only percussion and static, like the holiday itself was dying in real time. Sergeant First Class Devlin Cross sat across from Mason, feet up on a folding table, methodically disassembling and reassembling the trigger assembly of a sidearm he'd already cleaned twice. His hands moved from muscle memory alone. He hadn't looked down in 20 minutes. "You think Rourke's actually coming?" Devlin asked. "Rourke's always coming," Mason said. "That's the problem with Rourke. The order said 2,300. It's 2,307. Devlin set the sidearm down. "So he's late." "Rourke doesn't get late. Rourke gets delayed by circumstances beyond standard operational parameters." Mason made air quotes with one hand, which means something went sideways somewhere and he's going to walk through that door acting like it didn't. As if on cue, the door opened. Not Rourke. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Briggs stepped in, stomping frost off her boots, her breath coming in white clouds. She was the team's intelligence specialist, sharp, dry, and constitutionally allergic to anything she considered theater. She pulled her wool cap off and tucked it under her arm with the precision of someone who had been cold for so long she had simply reclassified it as a permanent condition. "Transport just cleared the outer gate," she said. Mason looked up. "One vehicle?" "Two. The captain's truck and a black government SUV with DC plates and a redacted manifest." She paused. "And Mason, there's a kid in the second vehicle." Silence. Devlin set the trigger assembly down on the table. The Christmas song cut out for 3 full seconds, then came back as only static. "Define kid," Mason said carefully. Briggs looked at him the way she looked at intelligence reports that contained obvious errors. "I mean, a child, a teenager, sitting in the back seat of a blacked-out government SUV on Christmas Eve at a classified testing facility in the middle of the Nevada desert." She let that land. "So however you want to define that." Captain Elias Rourke came through the door 90 seconds later, and he brought the cold in with him the way he always brought everything. Decisively, without apology, as though the temperature itself had made a tactical error by existing. He was not a large man, but he occupied space the way large men wished they could. Mid-40s, lean, with a face that had been weathered into something geological. a face that had stopped registering surprise sometime around his third overseas rotation and simply never resumed. He wore a field jacket with rank insignia and no unit patch. That detail alone told Mason everything he needed to know about the classification level of whatever this was. Behind him, Lieutenant Nora Vale entered and took a position to the right of the doorway with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been briefed and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Vale ran the marksmanship program at Raven Ridge, 28 years old, Ranger qualified, 2 deployments, and a competitive shooting record that put her in the top 2% of the entire defense community. If Rourke had brought her into this specifically, it was because this was a shooting evaluation. And then, last through the door, the girl. She was slight. That was the first thing Mason registered, and he hated himself for registering it, because it was exactly the kind of observation that led to exactly the kind of mistake soldiers made about people who didn't look like soldiers. She was slight, maybe 5'4", wearing an olive drab field jacket that was 2 sizes too large for her frame. The sleeves rolled to her forearms. Her hair was dark, braided back in a single tight plait. Not styled, not arranged, simply secured, the way someone braids their hair before a task that might require them to move fast. Her boots were broken in so completely that they had molded to the shape of her feet. These were not new boots. These were boots that had walked a long way. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at the room. She didn't look around the room the way visitors do, scanning for context, processing the unfamiliar. She looked at it the way a professional looks at an operational space. Exit points first, then high ground, then personnel. Her eyes moved with a quiet economy that Mason had only ever seen in people who had spent a significant amount of time in environments where reading a room incorrectly could get you killed. She was 17. The personnel file Rourke had forwarded, what existed of it, confirmed that. Most of it was blacked out. Name, redacted. History, redacted. Institutional affiliation, redacted. Age, 17. Security clearance, 3 levels above anything anyone in this room should have been looking at. And at the bottom of the file, in capital letters, a single operational designation, Candidate Rowan. Devlin looked at the girl. Then he looked at Mason. Then he looked back at the girl. And then, because Devlin had been doing this for 14 years and had learned, somewhere in the accumulated scar tissue of that experience, to say the thing that everyone else was only thinking. He said it. 17? He let the word sit in the air for a moment. That's the joke, right? A few of the others, Hendricks near the window, Torres by the equipment rack, made sounds that weren't quite laughs, but were the necessary precursor to laughs. The sounds you make when you're not sure yet whether something is actually funny or whether you're going to feel stupid for laughing. Rourke said nothing. Vale said nothing. The girl said nothing. And that silence, specifically hers, was what shut the room down. Not Rourke's authority, not Vale's ranking, not the sealed orders sitting in Rourke's breast pocket. The girl's silence. Because it wasn't the silence of someone who hadn't heard the joke. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment or of someone searching for a response. It was the silence of someone who had decided, somewhere far back in their development, that certain things were simply not worth the energy of a reaction. She looked at Rourke. Can we begin? Rourke opened the sealed orders and read them aloud while the room reformed itself into something resembling a professional briefing. Candidate Rowan was to be evaluated across a standard battery of marksmanship disciplines: long-range precision, moving target engagement, multi-position qualification, adverse condition performance. The evaluation was to be conducted in full against the team's existing benchmark scores. The team was to set the baseline. The candidate was to be assessed against that baseline. All results were classified. All personnel were bound by non-disclosure. Any attempt to access the candidate's background through unofficial channels would be considered a violation of the security agreement each person in this room had signed as a condition of their assignment. Devlin raised his hand. So, we're babysitting. You're evaluating, Rourke said. There's a difference. Sir, with respect, she's a teenager. She's a candidate. Rourke's voice didn't change temperature. And your job is to give her a fair assessment. That's it. That's the entire scope of what I'm asking you to do tonight. He folded the orders. Questions? Nobody asked any more questions. But Devlin looked at Hendricks, and Hendricks looked at Torres, and the understanding that passed between them, wordless, fast, the particular telepathy of people who have worked together in enclosed spaces for a long time, was clear. This is going to be a very short evaluation. The ready room smelled like the inside of a field locker, metal polish, gun oil, cold concrete, and the ghost of 1,000 cups of bad coffee that had been drunk in moments of mandatory patience. The operators pulled their gear and went through the familiar ritual of pre-range preparation with the comfort of habit. Weapons checked, magazines loaded, cold weather adjustments made to scopes and trigger mechanisms. Brief, practical talk. Wind call, range distance, lighting conditions. Nobody talked to Rowan. Not out of hostility, exactly. Out of assessment. She was an unknown variable in a room full of professionals who had learned to treat unknown variables with careful distance until they revealed themselves. You didn't extend warmth to something you hadn't classified yet. That was just protocol. Mason watched her. He had a habit, occupational, compulsive, of cataloging details that didn't fit the established pattern of a situation. It had served him in reconnaissance work across 3 continents. It served him now. The boots, again. The fit and wear pattern of the field jacket, not a government issue piece, but not civilian either. Something in between, something that had been altered or sourced from a supply chain that wasn't standard military. The braid was practical, but also old. The technique of it, the way it was anchored at the base of the skull, was the kind of braid someone had been wearing for years, not recently adopted. Her hands, when she checked the rifle assigned to her for the baseline evaluation, a .308 precision bolt action, scoped, nothing unusual, moved over it with the flat efficiency of someone performing a task they have performed so many times it has ceased to require thought. Function check, chamber inspection, scope verification, trigger pull test. 23 seconds. Mason had timed it involuntarily because his brain had started tracking anomalies, and this was one of them. Most trained shooters, even good ones, took 45 seconds minimum on an unfamiliar platform. They checked twice. They verified. They were careful because careful was how you didn't have a negligent discharge. 23 seconds. 1 pass. 0 hesitation. She set the rifle down and looked at the range map pinned to the wall. Studied it for perhaps 8 seconds. Then she turned around and stood with her hands loose at her sides, waiting. Devlin caught Mason's eye from across the room. The expression on his face had shifted slightly, still skeptical, but now with a fraction of something else underneath it. Not quite respect. Not yet. But the beginning of the question that precedes respect. Okay, but can she actually shoot? Mutt. Lieutenant Vale ran the baseline assessment with the crisp professionalism she brought to everything. She briefed the conditions. Wind reading from the northwest at 12 to 14 knots, with intermittent gusts to 18. Temperature dropping toward 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The primary target line at 500 meters, secondary at 700. Simulated stress protocol. Each shooter would be given a timed physical activation before engaging to simulate elevated heart rate. Standard 10-round qualification string. Scoring on a decimal point system where anything below 9.2 per shot began to meaningfully degrade the group average. We're looking for consistency, Vale told the assembled team, not heroics. I want to see what you can do under controlled duress. We set the number. The candidate shoots to the number. She didn't look at Rowan when she said this. She didn't need to. The implicit architecture of the briefing said everything. The professionals established the standard. The candidate tries to meet it. The team shot in sequence. Devlin went first. 14 years of precision marksmanship, a national-level competitive record, and hands steadied by the particular calm of someone who had made peace with pressure long ago. He completed the physical activation, 20 burpees in 45 seconds, designed to spike the heart rate to 160 plus, then moved to the rifle without pause, settled into position, and worked through his string with the smooth deliberation of a machine performing its intended function. His average, 9.41. Strong, genuinely strong. The kind of score that, in a standard evaluation, would be the benchmark. Hendricks shot next. A slightly different style, faster to the trigger, more aggressive in his breathing rhythm, but equally consistent. 9.38. Torres, who specialized in CQB and had always treated long-range precision as the necessary but less interesting cousin of his actual specialty, posted a 9.29. Respectable, given his focus. Specialist Quan, the youngest full operator on the team, 24, 2 years out of selection, shot a 9.44 and tried very hard not to look pleased with himself. 3 more operators. Scores ranging from 9.31 to 9.47. All of them good, all of them hard-earned, all of them representative of years of training and evaluation and repetition under conditions that would have ended the shooting careers of civilian competitors. By the time the last operator finished and the tablet displaying the scores was passed to Vale for recording, the ready room had developed the quiet, confident energy of a team that has just demonstrated, clearly and collectively, exactly what professionalism looks like. And then Vale called Rowan to the line. The readiness room went still, in the particular way it goes still when everyone is pretending not to watch something very closely. Rowan stepped to the line. No one had offered to spot for her. That was partly oversight, and partly the unconscious arrogance of a team that had, somewhere in the preceding 40 minutes, decided this was going to be a short and slightly embarrassing display. Nobody offered to spot for the candidate because offering to spot for the candidate implied she might need spotting, and spotting was something you did for shooters you took seriously. She didn't ask for a spotter. She completed the physical activation, same protocol as the others, 20 burpees in the cold, vapor rising from her skin when she stood up, and went straight to the rifle. No settling in period, no adjusting the position 5 times. She dropped into prone, confirmed her natural point of aim with a single shift of her hips, and became still. The wind hit 17 knots. The generator tower lights blinked. The broken Christmas song cut out entirely and left only silence and the low whine of the desert dark. Rowan fired. The shot broke clean. Downrange, the target registered a hit. She worked the bolt, fired again. Again. 10 rounds, 10 shots. The cadence was even. Not fast, not slow. Controlled. The spaces between shots were identical, as though she were operating on an internal metronome that had been set at the factory and never adjusted. When she fired the last round, she remained still for exactly 3 seconds, completing her follow-through with the kind of discipline that doesn't come from being told to do it, but from having internalized it so deeply it was simply part of how she existed. And then she cleared the weapon and stood. Vale looked at the tablet, entered the scoring data, looked at it again. The room was very quiet. "Say the number," Devlin said. Vale looked up. Something in her expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but in the way the light in a room shifts when someone opens a door somewhere far away. 9.71, she said. Silence. Quan, who had been leaning against the equipment rack with the deliberate casualness of someone who didn't want to appear invested, stopped leaning. Torres turned fully around from the window. Devlin sat up straight. 9.71. Against a field average after physical stress activation. In wind, at temperature on an unfamiliar platform, without a spotter. 9.71. "Run it again," Devlin said, not an accusation. More like a man asking the universe to confirm something it has just told him because he needs to hear it a second time to fully process it. Vale looked at him, then at Rowan, then back at the tablet. "Run it again," she agreed. They ran it again. Different platform this time. Vale pulled a second rifle from the case, a longer action, different caliber, different scope setup, not trying to trip the candidate, just confirming that the first result wasn't a statistical artifact of a lucky match between one shooter and one weapon system. Rowan looked at the new rifle, checked it in 21 seconds this time. Slightly slower, new caliber, different ballistic profile, the scope adjustment settings requiring a moment of actual calculation. She made the adjustment mentally, without writing anything down, without asking anyone, without referencing the data card clipped to the stock. She went to the line. She shot. 9.68. Someone said something under their breath. Mason didn't catch the words, only the tone, the specific flattened tone of a person recalibrating an entire series of assumptions simultaneously. The room's mocking energy had not simply died. It had been replaced by something else, something more complicated. The discomfort of capable people confronting capability that exceeds their own, in a form they hadn't anticipated, coming from a direction they had, frankly, dismissed. Nobody was smiling now. Nobody laughed. Rowan stood at the line and waited for the next instruction. That was the thing that got under Mason's skin most acutely. Not the scores, not the technique, not even the unnerving steadiness of someone who should, by every reasonable developmental metric, be still finding their footing in the world. It was the waiting. The quality of her stillness between tasks. Like a rifle left on a table, present, complete, not requiring anything from the room until the moment it was picked up and given a purpose. He had seen that quality in exactly 3 other people in his professional life. All 3 of them were people who had been through something that restructured their understanding of who they were at a very fundamental level. Vale raised the stakes. She didn't announce it as raising the stakes. She announced it as adjusting conditions to match operational parameters, which was the kind of language that made the same thing sound more clinical. But everyone in the room knew what it meant. If you want to see what someone is really made of, you don't give them the conditions they've trained for. You give them the conditions they haven't. Moving targets now. Steel silhouettes on a motorized track, variable speed, cross-cut at 600 meters. Wind holding at 14 to 16 knots with an irregular gust pattern that made reading it a dynamic problem rather than a static calculation. Engagement window. 20 seconds per target, 5 targets in sequence. The team shot again. Modified scores, naturally. Moving targets at distance and wind were a different discipline from static precision, and the averages dipped. Good scores, still. Adjusted competitive scores. The kind of numbers that made military record books. Rowan stepped to the line. She made a request, the first one she had made all evening. "Can I have 30 seconds to watch the track cycle?" Vale looked at her. "Yes." Rowan watched. Her head didn't move. Her eyes tracked the steel silhouettes with a stillness that suggested she wasn't just watching the targets. She was watching the pattern, the mechanical rhythm of the track, the micro variations in speed as the motor engaged and disengaged at the curve points, the way the gust interaction with the target face changed at different points along the track. 30 seconds. She looked away. "Ready," she said. The engagement window opened. She went 5 for 5. Not barely, not by scraping the edge of each window. She hit the first target at second 3 of its window, the second at second 4, the third at second 2. The last 2 she took in immediate succession, a double tap timing that required her to predict the track position and hold for the exact intersection of bullet flight path and target arc while simultaneously compensating for the wind. Devlin stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, the way you stand up involuntarily when you've witnessed something that your body has decided requires you to be vertical. "Who trained her?" he asked. He wasn't asking anyone in the room. It was the question escaping him despite his better judgment. Rourke, standing near the back wall, looked at Devlin without expression. "That's above your clearance level, Sergeant." "Everything about this is above my clearance level," Devlin said. He wasn't complaining, he was just stating a fact. "I'm just saying, someone trained her, someone very good trained her, because I've been doing this for 14 years and I don't shoot like that on moving targets." 14 years is a long time," Rourke said. "It's not enough time," Devlin said. "That's my point." "That's exactly my point." Mason stepped outside during the brief administrative interval between the moving target string and the final static qualification. He needed cold air and distance from the room and from the particular social complexity of watching 11 people deal with the experience of having their professional identities quietly taken apart by a teenager holding a rifle. He walked to the far side of the supply truck, out of the range of the generator tower's blinking lights, and stood in the genuine dark. He was out there for perhaps 4 minutes before he heard footsteps. He assumed it was Devlin, or Vale, someone from the team coming to debrief the experience in the way soldiers debrief things, obliquely, pragmatically, using humor or analysis as a buffer against the discomfort of direct emotional reckoning. It wasn't. Rowan came around the corner of the truck and stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other. She didn't retreat. She also didn't push forward into the space the way someone seeking company might. She simply stood at the edge of the truck's shadow, as if she had been looking for a specific quality of quiet and had found it and was now deciding whether another person in it changed the equation. "Cold out here," Mason said. Not brilliantly, but it was what he had. "I like the cold," she said. "Most people don't. Most people didn't grow up in the Cascades." A pause. "The mountains?" He nodded. "Your score tonight was something else." "My score tonight was acceptable," she said. The correction wasn't arrogant. It wasn't false modesty either. It sounded like the response of someone who had internalized a standard so demanding that acceptable was the ceiling of what they allowed themselves, because the alternative, satisfaction, felt like the beginning of a kind of softness they couldn't afford. "Acceptable," Mason repeated. "I missed a wind shift on the third moving target. My hold was 3 inches high on the second static qualifier." She said it like reading line items from a report. "Those are errors. Those are rounding errors. In some contexts," she said, "not in all of them." He looked at her for a moment. In the cold, without the pressure of the evaluation room around her, she looked younger. Not young. She had never looked young, not in any conventional sense, not with those eyes, but younger. The tight control that she wore in the ready room had relaxed by precisely one layer, like a building letting out a breath it had been holding. "Rowan," he said, and then stopped, because he wasn't sure what he was going to say after that. She looked at him. "How long have you been doing this?" A beat. Then, "What is this?" "Training, shooting, whatever the program is that produced what you showed in there tonight." She looked out at the dark range. The blinking lights from the tower reached this far, barely. A faint pulse of green, red, white, gone, green again. "I don't remember a time when I wasn't doing this," she said. That sentence sat between them in the cold for a moment. "That's a hard thing," Mason said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not offense, not agreement, something more considered than either of those. "It's the thing I have," she said. "I'm not sure hard and easy are the right categories." Then she looked down. In her hands, and he hadn't noticed because she had been holding them against her side in the dark, was a photograph. Small, worn along the edges. She held it with her bare hands in 18-degree weather and made no movement toward the warmth she could have had. He could see just what it was. A younger version of her, younger even than now, which seemed almost impossible, standing beside a tall man with the same dark eyes, both of them holding rifles, both of them in mountain country. The sky behind them was the specific blue of high altitude. There was snow on the ground. The man had his hand on her shoulder in a way that was protective and familiar and permanent looking in the way that some things look when they are about to become memories. He didn't ask. Some questions don't need to be asked. Some questions, if you ask them, take something out of the room that doesn't come back. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket. "I should go back in," she said. He nodded. "Yeah." She started to go, stopped. Turned back just slightly, not quite facing him, the way people turn when something else needs saying and they're deciding whether to say it. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking." And then she went back inside. Mason stood in the cold for another minute before following. The generator lights blinked. The broken Christmas song, carried faintly from the duty shack, played 4 bars before cutting to static again. He was still standing there, turning over the sentence she'd said, "I don't remember a time when I wasn't doing this," when the alarm hit. Not the slow test condition alert that preceded evaluation sequences, not the calibration tone or the range clearance signal, the hard alarm, the perimeter alarm, the one that didn't have a non-emergency application. It came over every speaker on the compound simultaneously, a single flat tone that predated discussion and skipped directly to action. Mason's hand went to his sidearm before his conscious mind had fully processed the sound. He turned toward the main building. Through the duty shack window, lit from inside, the faces of the team suddenly intent and operational. He could see Vale at the tactical screen, her posture carrying the particular tension of someone reading data they weren't expecting. He moved toward the entrance at speed. Behind him, somewhere in the dark near the supply truck, he heard Rowan's boots on the frozen ground, keeping pace. And when he glanced back, one quick, reflexive look, He saw her face. Not alarmed, not startled, ready. Like someone who had heard this alarm before. Like someone who had been expecting it. Like someone who knew, with the patient certainty of experience, that the night was not over, and that the paper targets had only ever been the beginning. Inside, Vale was already reading the display. 3 heat signatures, she said, her voice clipped and professional, writing just above the alarm tone. Outer perimeter, northwest approach. Moving in formation. Disciplined spacing. This isn't accidental. Rourke stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, face unreadable. Rourke, Mason said. What is this? Rourke said nothing. Mason looked at the screen. The 3 signatures were moving with purpose. Not running, not hesitating. Advancing. The kind of advancement that suggested a plan. He looked at Rowan. She was standing inside the door, still, watching the screen with the same quality of attention she had given the moving target track. Not passive observation, but active analysis. Reading the pattern, counting the variables, already building the picture. She looked at Mason, and for the first time all night, she said something she hadn't been asked. I'd take the high ground, she said quietly. Southeast ridgeline. You can cover all 3 approach vectors from there. A pause, barely a breath. If that's what this is. The room was completely still. Nobody laughed. Wolfgang. 3 armed heat signatures, moving in formation, and Rowan already knew where to be. The evaluation was over. Something else had just started. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. That was how long it took the room to recalibrate, to shift from the context of an evaluation into the context of a threat, to strip away the framework of scores and benchmarks and professional comparison and replace it with the older, simpler framework that soldiers revert to when something real is happening. 3 seconds of collective processing, the room breathing in, and then everyone moving at once. Mason was already at the tactical screen beside Vale before the alarm tone cut to its secondary pulse. Lower, steadier, the frequency that meant confirmed contact rather than suspected contact. The distinction mattered. Suspected contact was a precaution. Confirmed contact was a problem. Talk to me, he said. Vale's fingers moved over the display with the efficient economy of someone who had run threat assessments under pressure enough times that the interface had become an extension of her thinking rather than a tool she operated. Thermal shows 3 individuals. Outer wire, northwest quadrant. They came in from the hard pan. No vehicle signature, which means either they were dropped at distance and walked in, or they've been staged out there for a while waiting for a specific time window. How long have they been moving? Motion alert triggered 40 seconds ago. Based on their current rate of advance, they were at the outer fence line approximately 4 minutes before that. So they were there before the evaluation ended. Yes. Mason looked at Rourke. Rourke was standing exactly where he had been standing when the alarm hit. Back wall, arms at his sides now instead of crossed. The posture of a man who had shifted from observation mode into decision mode without any of the physical tells that transition usually produced. His face gave nothing. Captain, Mason said. The word came out with a particular weight, not insubordination, but the weight of a senior NCO who has decided that the window for polite deference has closed. I need to know if this is part of the evaluation. Why does that change your response? Rourke said. Because if it's part of the evaluation, my response is controlled and measured and designed to look good on a report. And if it's not, my response is different. A beat. Your response should be the same either way, Rourke said. That's not an answer, sir. No, Rourke agreed. It isn't. Devlin pulled his second magazine and press-checked his sidearm in one fluid motion, a habit so ingrained it happened below the level of conscious decision. I'm going to go ahead and treat it as real, he announced to no one in particular. Professionally speaking. Nobody argued with that. Vale pulled up the compound schematic on the secondary display, a wireframe overlay of the proving grounds showing all structures, approach lanes, fields of fire, and elevated positions. She had it on screen in under 6 seconds. The 3 thermal signatures were marked as orange diamonds at the northwest corner, moving in a staggered column formation with roughly 8 meters between each element. Disciplined spacing, Mason said, more to himself than anyone else. They're not bunching. Someone trained these people. Or they've been briefed to look like someone trained them, Briggs said from the far side of the room. She had her notebook open, which under any other circumstances would have been incongruous. But Briggs had a habit of writing things down in moments of pressure because she trusted handwriting more than she trusted memory when the adrenaline was running. If this is a stress drill, the design would include realistic tactical behavior. It's always a stress drill until it isn't, Torres said. He was already pulling his kit from the rack. Chest rig, low profile, the setup he used for close terrain work. I'll take the east approach. Nobody's taking any approach yet, Mason said sharply. Then he looked at Vale. What are our assets? Right now, tonight, what do we actually have? Vale ran the inventory without needing to look at a list. She had been running this facility long enough to carry its capabilities in her head the way a surgeon carries the layout of the operating theater. 7 operators present, plus you, plus Briggs. Rourke is non-tactical tonight. He came in a suit jacket and a service weapon, which tells me he came to observe, not to shoot. Long-range capability sits in the sniper nest at the east end of the observation bunker. That's our highest ground, and it covers the northwest approach directly. She stopped. The room understood what she had stopped before. The sniper nest. The northwest approach. The highest ground that covered all 3 confirmed threat vectors simultaneously. Everyone looked at Rowan. Rowan was standing near the door with her arms loose and her weight distributed the way she had been standing all night. Not at attention, not casual, but in that particular middle state that suggested she could move in any direction at the same speed. She was looking at the tactical display. She had been looking at it since Vale brought it up, and from the angle she was standing and the stillness of her eyes, she had been reading it the same way she had read the range map. Not casually, but with the systematic absorption of someone building a 3-dimensional picture from a 2-dimensional representation. I already told you where I'd go, she said. Quiet. Flat. Not pushing, just stating. Devlin made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something harder to name. She did, he said. She actually did. He looked at Mason. She called the southeast ridgeline before the alarm had been running for 30 seconds. I said that's where I'd go, Rowan said. The sniper nest is better, fixed position, ballistic glass, established range cards. She looked at Vale. Does the nest have current dope on the northwest approach lane? Vale stared at her for a moment. Range cards are updated quarterly. Last update was 6 weeks ago. Wind shift since then? Prevailing pattern changed in November. Net correction would be approximately half a minute of angle left at 400, 3/4 at 600. Rowan nodded, filed it. Done. I need someone who can spot, she said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence that had followed her shooting. That silence had been the silence of people absorbing something unexpected. This silence was the silence of people making a decision they hadn't anticipated having to make. The decision to put a 17-year-old girl in a prepared firing position against what might be a real threat on Christmas Eve in a facility that was supposed to be a controlled evaluation environment. Mason looked at Rourke one more time. Rourke met his eyes. Priority 1, Rourke said, and his voice carried the specific cadence of someone delivering a line they had been authorized to deliver and had been waiting for the right moment to say, is the candidate. Mason parsed that for exactly 1 second. Then, Briggs, you're spotting. Torres, East Lane. Hendricks, Quan, you're on the main structure perimeter. Devlin, you're with me on the north approach. He looked at Vale. You're coordinating from here. I want radio checks every 90 seconds. Understood, Vale said. He looked at Rowan last. She was already moving toward the equipment rack, pulling the long rifle she had used for the final qualification string. The one she had shot 9.68 on, the one whose ballistic characteristics she had already integrated into her internal model of how to engage targets at distance in these conditions. She checked it without ceremony. Magazines? Cold weather lubricant distribution. Scope reticle illumination set to the minimum usable level, which was the correct setting for night work. Bright enough to see, dim enough not to destroy the natural night vision she had been carefully protecting by staying away from the direct lighting in the ready room for the past 20 minutes. Mason registered that detail, the lighting choice, the deliberate management of her night adaptation, and filed it with everything else he had been filing all evening. She turned and looked at him. "I'm ready," she said. "I know you are," he said, and meant it. The room broke into motion. Outside, somewhere beyond the perimeter wire, the 3 orange diamonds continued their advance. The blinking lights on the generator tower kept blinking. Green, red, white, and different and cheerful and completely out of place in what the compound had become. The broken Christmas song played one more bar from the duty shack speaker and then cut to silence. It didn't come back. The observation bunker sat at the east end of the range, a low concrete structure built into a natural rise in the terrain, so that from the outside it read as a feature of the landscape rather than a constructed position. This was intentional. The entire facility had been designed with the understanding that you didn't advertise your best vantage points. The sniper nest occupied the top level of the bunker, accessed by a steel ladder from the interior, with a firing aperture that faced northwest and gave a clean line of sight across the full width of the approach corridor, out to approximately 800 meters before the terrain folded. It was cold inside the bunker in the way that concrete holds cold. Not wind cold, not the aggressive cold of the open desert, but a deep ambient cold that had been accumulating in the walls for months and radiated outward with the patient permanence of something geological. Briggs, climbing the ladder behind Rowan, exhaled and watched her breath hang in the beam of her red lens flashlight. "How are you doing?" Briggs asked. "Fine," Rowan said. She reached the top of the ladder and pushed through the hatch into the nest. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." Rowan set the rifle on the shooting bench and opened the aperture shield, a steel plate on a pivot that could be swung back to expose the firing port or forward to protect the position. Cold air flooded in, direct and unfiltered. "I'm fine." Briggs climbed through the hatch and took up her position on the spotter's mat to the right of the firing bench. She had a spotting scope, a military-grade unit with thermal overlay capability, which in the current conditions was worth considerably more than the standard optical glass. She set it up with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions, on worse surfaces, with worse equipment. She put her eye to the scope and found the northwest approach lane. "I've got the signatures," she said immediately. 3 individuals. They've closed to approximately 340 meters from your position. Moving slowly now. Reduce speed in the last 2 minutes. "They know they're inside the inner detection envelope," Rowan said. She was settling into her position, making the micro-adjustments to the rifle and her own body that aligned them into a single functional unit. They slowed down because rushing now creates noise and thermal bloom. They'll hold at approximately 280 to 250 meters and reassess before the final approach. Briggs looked at her, then back through the scope. "You're saying they have a protocol. I'm saying they move like people with a protocol. And if this is a drill?" Rowan made the final adjustment to her scope elevation, incorporating Vale's wind correction data. "Then the protocol is part of the drill design," she said. "Either way, I engage the same." Briggs absorbed that. She was not by nature or training a field operator. Her work was intelligence analysis, patterns, data, the architecture of intent extracted from fragments of information. She was good at it, good enough to have been assigned to a facility that didn't officially exist, working for a program that didn't officially have a name. But she was not a shooter, and she was not accustomed to being in a prepared firing position at 1 a.m. with an unknown threat advancing toward her. She was, however, a professional. And the most useful professional thing she could do right now was spot effectively and keep her personal experience of this situation completely out of the operational space they were sharing. "Copy," she said. "I'll call your hits." Mason's voice came over the radio clip to Briggs's shoulder. "Nest, check." "Nest is up," Briggs replied. "Visual on all 3 signatures, holding at 320. Copy. North approach is clear to 150. No additional signatures on thermal. Hold your position." "Holding." The radio cycled to Devlin on the north lane, then Torres on the east, then Hendricks at the main structure. All clear. All holding. The compound had gone from a half-attended test facility, to a functioning defensive perimeter in under 8 minutes, which was, Mason thought, not bad for a team that had been expecting to spend the night checking gear and resenting the calendar. In the sniper nest, Rowan lay still. She did not speak. She did not shift her position. She did not betray, through any observable physical behavior, the state of her interior experience, whether she was calm, whether she was afraid, whether she felt anything at all. She breathed at a rate that Briggs, watching her peripherally while managing the spotting scope, estimated at approximately 6 breaths per minute, which was lower than the resting rate of most trained adults. Lower than sleep for some people. It was the breathing of someone who had reduced their entire organism to its most efficient possible configuration and was now simply waiting for the moment when it would be required to perform. Briggs had worked with operators for 6 years. She had sat in briefing rooms and debrief rooms with people who had done things in places that never made the news. People who had looked at situations that would shred the average person and made pragmatic tactical decisions without visible distress. She had developed, over those 6 years, a calibrated sense of what operational composure looked like. The genuine article versus the performed version. The difference between someone who was truly settled and someone who was managing terror with technique. Rowan was the genuine article. And that was, in its way, the most unsettling thing Briggs had witnessed all night. Not the scores, not the target knowledge, not the questions she had asked about range card corrections. The breathing, the quality of the stillness, the sense that this 17-year-old girl had found a place inside herself that was entirely beyond the reach of the current situation's capacity to disturb her. Whatever had made Rowan, it had gone very deep. 3 signatures holding at 290, Briggs said. They've stopped. Stopped moving or stopped and taking a knee? Briggs adjusted the scope magnification. The thermal bloom of 3 heat sources resolved into clearer shapes. Bipedal, upright, but with the slightly compressed outline of individuals who had reduced their own silhouettes. Taking a knee. Lead element is scanning. He's got a thermal monocular, so I can see the glass, she paused. He's looking directly at the bunker. A long beat. Does he see us? Rowan asked. The aperture is shielded. If we're dark inside, we're reading as ambient temperature from outside. Briggs kept her voice level. He's scanning, not targeting. He doesn't have a fix. Rowan said nothing. She made a single, minute adjustment to her position, left elbow fractionally forward, which would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching very carefully, and returned to stillness. The radio. All elements, sit rep. Mason's voice dry and controlled. Briggs keyed her mic. Nest. Signatures have halted at 290. Lead is scanning with thermal. We are undetected as yet. A pause. Then, copy. Hold. Do not engage until my call. Copy. In the cold dark of the nest, the only sounds were the wind across the aperture opening and the barely audible rhythm of Rowan's breathing and the distant, indistinct voice of the radio cycling through the other elements. Then Rowan said very quietly, not into the radio but to Briggs, "The lead element has been there before." Briggs looked at her without moving her eye from the scope. "Why do you say that?" "The way he's scanning. He started at the northwest corner of the main structure and moved clockwise to the bunker, then to the generator tower, then back to the main structure. That's the security camera placement sequence. He knows where the sensors are." Briggs looked back through the scope, watched the lead figure's head movement, ran the sequence Rowan had described against what she was observing. She was right. "If he knows the sensor placement," Briggs said carefully, "then either he has access to the facility layout or he's been here before in a capacity that gave him operational knowledge of the space. Or," Rowan said, "he was briefed by someone who has." The sentence sat in the cold between them. Neither of them said the thing that sentence logically pointed toward. It was the kind of thought you filed and returned to later, in a warmer room, when the immediate situation had resolved and you had the bandwidth for implications. The lead figure stopped scanning, made a hand signal. The 2 trailing elements shifted position, not advancing, but spreading laterally, increasing the distance between them. Tactical dispersion. They were preparing to move. "They're about to advance," Briggs said into the radio. "Copy," Mason said. "All elements, weapons free on my mark. Stand by." Briggs felt her heartbeat doing something she was professionally obligated to manage. She managed it. She kept her eye on the scope, kept the 3 signatures in frame, kept her voice ready to call corrections if Rowan needed to fire. She glanced at Rowan one more time. Rowan's finger was outside the trigger guard. That was correct. That was disciplined. That was the practiced restraint of someone who had internalized the rule: you do not touch the trigger until you are prepared to fire, and you do not fire until you have been authorized. So completely that it was not a rule anymore, but simply the shape of how she operated. She was looking through the scope with both eyes soft, her dominant eye doing the technical work, and her non-dominant eye maintaining peripheral awareness of the broader field. That technique, used by experienced snipers to avoid the tunnel vision that killed people, was not in the standard training syllabus for anyone below a certain level of specialization. Briggs made a mental note, filed it next to everything else she had been filing. The 3 figures began to move. Advancing, Briggs said. All 3. Speed is increased. They've committed to the approach. 270 meters, 260. Copy, Mason said. His voice was very steady. All elements, stand by. 250 meters, lead is in the approach corridor. 2nd and 3rd elements are flanking. They're going wide. I see them, Rowan said, barely above a breath. 220 meters. Briggs paused. The thermal signatures were sharpening as they closed distance, the heat bloom of moving bodies brighter and more defined than stationary ones. She could see the outline of what the lead figure was carrying. Long object, held at a low-ready position. Lead is armed, rifle-length object, low-ready. The radio was silent. Then Mason said, Nest, you have the shot, your call. And there it was, not a drill instruction, not an evaluation prompt, a direct authorization in the field voice of a senior NCO who had made the calculation and was placing his trust in the capability he had just spent 2 hours watching demonstrate itself. Your call. Rowan breathed in. She breathed out. Her finger moved to the trigger. Briggs held absolutely still, the spotting scope locked on the lead figure, her lips ready to call the hit. The wind was reading 14 knots, sustained, with no gust spike in the last 40 seconds. The lead figure was at 210 meters, moving at a steady pace. Approximately 2 meters per second, which meant the firing solution was a leading hold rather than a static one. At this distance, in this wind, with this load, the bullet flight time was just over a quarter of a second, which meant she needed to place the reticle not where the target was, but where the target would be when the bullet arrived. Rowan held. She held for longer than Briggs expected. 3 seconds, 4, 5. And Briggs was starting to form a question in the back of her mind when she understood. Rowan wasn't waiting for confidence. She had confidence. She was waiting for the lead figure to step into a specific position, a slight rise in the terrain at 205 meters that would bring him into the cleanest possible silhouette against the slightly warmer ground temperature behind him, maximizing the contrast on the thermal overlay and eliminating any ambiguity in the hit confirmation. She was waiting for the perfect shot. The lead figure stepped onto the rise. Rowan fired. The sound in the confined space of the sniper nest was enormous, even through Briggs's hearing protection, a sharp, flat concussion that she felt as much as heard. The spotting scope jumped in her hands from the instinctive flinch she couldn't entirely suppress, and she forced herself back onto the target picture immediately. The lead figure went down. Not fell. Went down. The specific non-ballistic collapse of something that had been moving and was now entirely not moving, the way targets go down when the hit is center mass and the kinetic transfer is total. Hit, Briggs said. Lead element, center mass, down and not moving. She moved the scope. The second figure had stopped at the sound of the shot. Half a second of frozen reaction, which was human and understandable, but also, in the context of what was coming, exactly the wrong choice. Rowan had already worked the bolt. The case was still in the air. She fired again. Hit, Briggs said. Second element, down. The third figure was running, not advancing. Running, lateral movement, breaking from the approach corridor and heading for the fold in the terrain to the west that offered dead ground. Third element is running, Briggs said, tracking. Moving west, fast, toward the terrain break at I have it, Rowan said. The third figure reached the edge of the thermal signature's clean field. Another 2 seconds and it would drop below the natural ridgeline and be in cover. 1.5. 1. Rowan led the running figure by an amount that Briggs, watching the scope, estimated was exactly correct for the speed and the distance and the wind. She fired. The figure at the terrain break went down. Third element, Briggs said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Down at the terrain break. All 3 signatures are static. The radio. Shots fired from the nest. Nest, report. 3 shots, Briggs said. 3 engagements. All signatures are static. Compound is clear. A very long pause. Longer than radio discipline strictly required. Then Mason's voice. Copy. All elements, hold positions. Sweep team on me, northwest approach. We're going to have a look. Briggs took her eye from the scope and looked at Rowan. Rowan had cleared the weapon. Safe, bolt locked back, the practice post-engagement sequence completed without being asked. She was looking out through the aperture at the dark range, and her face in the cold glow of the thermal scope's ambient light was absolutely unreadable. Not triumphant, not relieved, not disturbed. Still. You're all right? Briggs asked. A pause that was not quite silence because the wind was still running through the aperture, and somewhere across the compound a radio was cycling. I want to know what they're going to find out there, Rowan said. So do I, Briggs said. They waited. The generator lights kept blinking against the Nevada dark, and the cold inside the bunker had settled into everything. Into the concrete walls, into the fabric of their field jackets, into the particular kind of silence that falls after shots have been fired, and the world is waiting to understand what they meant. The sweep team reached the first static signature in 4 minutes. Mason's voice came over the radio, and the quality of it, the flat, stripped-down affect of a man confronting something that has reorganized the operating picture, reached Briggs before the words fully registered. Nest, he said, you need to hear this. Briggs keyed her mic. Send it. The signatures. A pause that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that what was coming would change something. They're not people. The cold in the bunker seemed to go 1 degree deeper. Say again, Briggs said. Advanced training simulators, Mason said. Motorized frames, thermal emitting cores calibrated to human body temperature, remote operated movement systems. Another pause. This is the most sophisticated stress evaluation equipment I have ever seen. Somebody built this entire scenario specifically for tonight. Briggs looked at Rowan. Rowan was looking at the aperture. Her expression had not changed. Her hands, on the cleared rifle, were completely still. Rowan, Briggs said. Rowan turned. Did you know? Briggs asked. Not accusatory. Genuine. The kind of question you ask when you need to understand something and you've decided that the only way to understand it is to ask directly. Rowan looked at her for a moment. The thermal scope's faint ambient glow caught the angle of her face, the lines of it older than they should have been, the eyes carrying something that had been installed there by experiences that should have come later, if at all. I didn't know, she said, but I wasn't surprised. There's a difference between those 2 things, Briggs said. Yes, Rowan said. There is. She looked back out through the aperture into the dark where 3 sophisticated machines were lying in the frozen Nevada hardpan with precise holes in their thermal cores. Someone built that scenario for tonight, Mason had said. Someone who knew the facility. Someone who knew the sensor placement sequence. Someone who knew Rowan would be here. And what she could do, and what it would take to show it under pressure that couldn't be manufactured on a static range with paper targets and wind flags. Someone who had designed not just an evaluation but a demonstration. The question, the one that had been building all evening, from the blacked-out file and the DC plates and the sealed orders and the photograph of a younger Rowan standing in mountain country beside a man who was no longer alive, pressed itself against the inside of Briggs's chest like something trying to get out. Who built this? And who exactly was it built for? She kept that question internal. This wasn't the moment for it. The moment for it was later, in better light, with more information and less adrenaline. She keyed her mic. Copy, Mason. We're coming down. She looked at Rowan one final time. Rowan was already moving toward the hatch, rifle secured, posture carrying the same quality it had carried all night. Complete, self-contained, a unit of one that had somehow become the most important variable in a situation nobody had fully explained to anyone in this facility. She dropped through the hatch and disappeared down the ladder without ceremony. Briggs took one last look through the spotting scope at the northwest approach lane. At the 3 static signatures, the 3 perfect shots, the 3 machines lying in the desert dark like answers to questions nobody had thought to ask yet. Then she closed the aperture shield and followed Rowan down into the dark. The ladder was cold steel under Rowan's hands, and she descended it the way she did everything, without wasted motion, without looking down, trusting the structure to be what it presented itself as being. Briggs came down behind her, and they moved through the lower level of the observation bunker in single file, past the equipment cages and the field desk with its laminated range diagrams and the shelf of cold weather maintenance supplies that nobody had touched in weeks. The bunker door opened outward, a heavy steel frame that Rowan pushed with one shoulder, and then the Nevada night was on them again, full and cold and carrying the mineral smell of frozen ground. The compound had changed in the 40 minutes they had been in the nest. Not physically. The structures were where they had been. The generator tower still blinked its indifferent holiday pattern. The hardpan still stretched away into darkness in every direction. But the quality of the space had changed the way a room changes after something significant has happened in it. The air felt used. The silence had a different texture. Not the silence of a quiet night, but the silence of a situation that had recently been loud and was now processing itself. Mason and the sweep team were coming back from the northwest approach. She could see their red lens flashlights moving across the desert floor in the unhurried pattern of people conducting a deliberate clearance rather than an emergency response. 4 figures, steady pace, no urgency in their movement, which told Rowan what she needed to know about the condition of what they had found before the radio had told her anything. She walked toward them. Devlin saw her first. He was carrying one of the thermal simulators, or what remained of it after her round had passed through its core assembly. It was roughly human-shaped, or had been, a jointed aluminum and polymer frame, approximately the size and mass distribution of an adult male, with a sealed heating element in the torso cavity designed to produce a thermal signature that matched a living person's body heat at operational distances. The frame had been dressed in tactical clothing and equipped with a motion system in the lower joints that produced the gait pattern of a walking human being when viewed through thermal optics. It was, genuinely, the most sophisticated training device Rowan had ever seen. She had seen a lot of training devices. Devlin set it down when she was 6 feet away. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. So the others had been dismissal, then reluctant adjustment, then professional respect. This was something else. This was the expression of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just discovered that the assumptions were not only wrong, but were wrong in a direction he hadn't considered. "Hell of a shot," he said. 3 of them. "The third was marginal," Rowan said. She looked at the frame. The entry point of her round was a clean circle in the upper torso, slightly right of center. "I caught the edge of the thermal core instead of the center mass. Another 4 inches, and it would have been a miss." Devlin stared at her. 4 inches right of center at 190 meters, running target, at night, in 14-knot wind. He paused. "That's not marginal. That's a kill shot." "On a person it would be," she said. "On a machine it depends where the critical systems are housed." He stared at her for another moment. Then he picked up the frame, tucked it under his arm, and kept walking toward the main building without another word. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Not softened, because Devlin Cross didn't soften, but shifted, in the way a man's posture shifts when he has stopped fighting a fact and started incorporating it. Mason reached her as Devlin passed. He looked tired in the way that operational people look tired, not sleep-deprived, but processing fatigued. The particular exhaustion of a night that has asked too many consecutive questions. He had his field jacket zipped to the throat and his hands in his pockets, which was a non-tactical posture and meant he was, at least for this moment, not thinking in tactical terms. "You're all right?" he asked. It was the same question Briggs had asked in the nest, and it landed the same way. Not as evaluation, not as protocol, but as genuine inquiry. The kind of question you ask because you actually want to know. "I'm all right," she said, and then because something about the quality of his asking seemed to require more than that. It didn't feel different from the range. He looked at her. Shooting at moving targets in the dark with no confirmation of whether they were real or not didn't feel different from the range. She met his eyes. "I made the same calculation I make on any engagement. I assessed the target. I made a firing decision. I fired." A pause. The variables were the same, the inputs were the same, the output was the same. And if they had been real? She didn't look away. Then the output would have been appropriate. He held her gaze for a long moment. The wind ran between them, cold and indifferent, carrying grit from the desert floor. "Come inside," he said finally. "Rourke wants everybody in the ready room." She followed him in. The ready room had been rearranged while she was in the nest. The folding chairs pulled into a rough semicircle, the equipment racks pushed back. The tactical display on Vale's station still running, but with the threat overlay removed and replaced by a clean compound schematic. The operators were filtering in from their positions, the controlled movement of people standing down from alert status, and the room's energy was doing the complex thing that rooms do when an adrenaline event ends and the people in them have to decide what to do with what they're carrying. Torres dropped into a chair and ran both hands through his hair. Quan set his rifle in the rack with careful deliberation. Hendricks poured himself coffee from the pot on the side table, looked at it, set it down without drinking. Nobody was talking. Rourke was standing at the front of the room. He had removed his field jacket and was in shirt sleeves, which was a choice that functioned as a statement, a deliberate reduction of formality that said, in the body language grammar of people who spent their lives in hierarchical environments, that what was about to happen was not a formal debrief, but something more direct than that. He waited until everyone was in the room, then he looked at Rowan. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't a command in the usual sense. It was the tone you used with someone you were about to tell something to, something they might need to be sitting for. She sat. He looked at the assembled team, at Mason, at Briggs, at Vale, who had left her station and was standing near the wall with her arms crossed and her face carrying the specific expression of someone who had formed a theory they were waiting to see confirmed or denied. "The evaluation is complete," Rourke said. "What you witnessed tonight, on the range and in the field, is classified at the same level as the candidate's file. You do not discuss it. You do not document it outside of your required operational report. You do not speculate about it with personnel outside this room." He paused. "That's not a suggestion." "Understood," Mason said. A few others echoed it. "Candidate Rowan," Rourke said, "has passed every element of tonight's assessment. The range qualification, the adverse conditions evaluation, the stress engagement protocol." He looked at her steadily. "With performance metrics that place her outside the standard scoring architecture." "Outside how?" Vale asked. "Outside as in the scoring architecture doesn't have a category for what she posted tonight." Rourke's voice was flat, professional, scrubbed of anything interpretive. "She didn't exceed the top of the scale. She invalidated the scale." The room absorbed that. Devlin said, "What happens now?" Rourke looked at him. "That's above your clearance level, Sergeant." "With respect, sir, that's the second time tonight you've said that." "And it'll keep being true," Rourke said. "Some information belongs to different rooms than this one. This is not the room for what happens next." He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. "What I can tell you is that transport arrives at 0500. The candidate is in your care until then. My expectation is that you treat her accordingly." He looked around the room one last time. "Good work tonight. All of you." He put his jacket on and walked out. The room sat with his absence for a moment. Then Torres said, to no one in particular, "So we just stay here until 0500 and pretend tonight was normal?" "Tonight was not normal," Quan said. "I know it wasn't normal," Torres said. "That's my point." "Your point doesn't have a resolution," Briggs said from the doorway. "So let's table it." Mason looked at Rowan. She was sitting in the chair Rourke had directed her to, hands on her knees, looking at the middle distance with the quality of attention she directed at things she was genuinely thinking through rather than simply observing. She was still wearing her field jacket. The braid was still perfect. 14 hours of activity and cold, and a fully live firing engagement, and the braid was still exactly as she had tied it, because she had tied it for function and it had performed its function. "You hungry?" Mason asked her. She looked up. The question seemed to briefly disconnect her from whatever she had been working through. "What?" "Hungry," he said. "There's food in the mess tent. Not much, but something." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in the way it had shifted outside by the supply truck, that fractional reduction of the operational layer, the one below which something younger and less calibrated existed. "I could eat," she said. The mess tent was attached to the rear of the main structure by a canvas connector that did approximately nothing to block the cold. Inside, a space heater the size of a small suitcase ran at maximum output and managed to elevate the ambient temperature to something that registered as bearable rather than comfortable. The lighting was a single fluorescent strip, and someone had at some point taped a paper cutout of a Christmas tree to the support pole in the center. Green construction paper, lopsided star, clearly made by someone with a sense of humor and no artistic training whatsoever. It was objectively not a festive space, but it was warm enough, and there was coffee, and Quan had found a foil-wrapped pie in the cold locker, apple from a bakery 40 miles away, purchased before the holiday by someone who had planned ahead, and had cut it with a field knife into 8 approximately equal slices. By the time the team had filtered in, the mess tent had taken on the peculiar warmth that enclosed spaces develop when people who have been through something together occupy them in the aftermath. Not comfortable, exactly. Not celebratory, but alive in a specific way, the way a fire is alive after the storm that fed it. Rowan took a plate and stood slightly apart from the group, the way she had been standing slightly apart all evening, not isolated, but observing her own distance, maintaining a margin. Briggs sat down across the table from her, set her coffee mug down, said nothing. Quan dropped into the chair at the end of the table and pulled his pie toward him. He looked at Rowan with the direct curiosity of someone young enough to not have fully learned the operator's habit of muffling genuine interest behind professional affect. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She considered the question the way she considered most things, with a beat of actual thought before the response. "My father," she said. "He's military?" A pause. "He was." Quan registered the tense and had the grace to not push past it. "He must have been incredible." She looked at her plate. "He was the best shooter I ever knew," she said, "until I got better than him." A beat. He was proud of that. He said that was the point. The tent was quiet enough that everyone heard it, even the people pretending to be focused on their coffee. Mason set his mug down. "How old were you?" "When I got better than him?" She thought about it. 14. Nobody said anything. "He died before I turned 15, she said. The sentence was clean, factual, carrying no performance of grief. The grief was there, Briggs thought. You could feel it the way you feel the mass of something in the dark without being able to see it. But Rowan had located it somewhere internal and load-bearing. Somewhere it functioned as structure rather than expression. It was an operation. The details are classified. She paused. Most of the details. The ones I've been able to piece together suggest it wasn't what they said it was. What do they say it was? Mason asked. Training accident? She met his eyes. In December, on a range not unlike this one. The fluorescent strip hummed. The space heater ran. Outside, the generator tower lights kept blinking through the canvas wall, a faint stained glass pattern of green, red, white. That's why you're here, Briggs said. Not a question. Rowan looked at her. I'm here because I passed the preliminary assessment and met the program criteria. That's the official version. A very slight pause. There might be other versions. Rowan. Briggs leaned forward fractionally. You don't have to protect the information in this room. We're all bound by the same classification level. And you just spent an evening demonstrating things that people with access to your file have clearly been preparing to demonstrate for a long time. She kept her voice level, kept it professional, but the edge of genuine concern was in it. Real concern, not performed. I want to understand what this is, not for a report, Because I've been watching you all night, and I think you deserve someone asking you the real questions. Rowan looked at her for a long time. The tent breathed around them. Someone shifted a chair. Torres poured more coffee. My father's operation, Rowan said at last, was officially a training incident at a classified facility. Cause of death? Weapons discharged during live fire evaluation. She paused. I was 13 when they told me. I spent 2 years trying to find out what actually happened, because the details I could access didn't fit the official account. The range location was wrong. The unit designation didn't match his last known assignment. The after-action report had been amended 3 times in 18 months. She looked at the table. I started training harder after he died. Not to honor him. Not for any reason that would make a good story. I trained harder because training was the only context in which I understood the rules completely. Everything else had too many variables I couldn't control. Quan, who had been very still, said quietly, "And the program found you." "I found the program," she said, "or I found the edge of it. And then the program found me." A pause. "That's not something I can say more about." The tent sat with that. Mason was watching her with the same attention he had been bringing to her all evening. The cataloging attention, the reconnaissance habit, reading details and building pictures. But there was something different in it now, something that had moved past professional assessment into something less categorizable. "The photograph," he said. "Your father." She looked at him. "You were holding it outside by the truck," he said, "during the evaluation break." She reached into her jacket pocket. She didn't take the photograph out, just touched it, the way you touch something that confirms its continued presence. "I carry it on operations," she said. "It's—" She stopped, started again. "It's the last image of him that was taken before things went wrong. We were in the Cascades, training trip. I just hit a 600-meter static target for the first time." A pause so brief it almost wasn't one. He was laughing. He almost never laughed. The mess tent was completely quiet. Not the quiet of awkwardness or of people trying to find the next appropriate thing to say. The quiet of people who have heard something true and are letting it exist without covering it over. Rowan looked at her plate, her jaw set slightly. Not against tears, Briggs thought, but against the reflex of expression itself. The long-trained reflex of someone who had decided, at some point before they should have had to, that showing the shape of what they felt was a liability. "I'm sorry," Mason said. Simple. Direct. Not performing condolence. She looked at him. Something crossed her face. Fast. Complex. The expression of someone receiving something they don't have a fully developed protocol for receiving. "Thank you," she said. And then, after a beat, "That's not something people say to me very often, in the context I usually operate in." "What do people say to you?" Quan asked. She almost smiled. Not quite. The expression got to the threshold and stopped. "Good shooting," she said, or variations on that theme. "Good shooting," Devlin said, from the entrance of the mess tent, where he had apparently been standing for some portion of the conversation with his coffee mug and a piece of pie, and the particular discretion of someone who has heard enough to understand that this was not a debrief he should interrupt. He walked in and sat down at the end of the table. He looked at Rowan. "I was wrong about you," he said. No qualifications, no layering, the flat, direct version that cost something to say. She looked at him. "You were consistent with the available information." "I was an ass," he said. "The information is not the point." She studied him for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and drank some of it, and there was something in that gesture, its ordinariness, its quiet acceptance of what he'd said, that was its own kind of response. "Your first shot tonight," Devlin said. "The 9.71. I want to understand something. The wind shifted between your second and third round. Most shooters, even good ones, lose half a point when the wind shifts mid-string. You didn't. Your average didn't drop." He paused. "How did you know it was going to shift?" She set her mug down. "The pressure change. There was a differential in the atmospheric pressure between the range floor and the first berm that's been building since approximately 2200. Wind shifts in this kind of terrain almost always run from high to low pressure along the natural drainage corridors." She looked at him with the directness of someone discussing a technical problem. I calculated the likely shift timing before I started my string and built the hold adjustment into the sequence from round 2 onward. Devlin stared at her. You pre-compensated for a wind shift. Yes. Based on a pressure differential you were reading passively. Yes. While under physical stress activation. The physical activation was useful, actually, she said. It elevated my respiratory rate enough to increase my sensory sensitivity. Some people lose accuracy under physical stress. I tend to gain it. The silence that followed was the silence of the room running this sentence through its understanding of how human beings work, and arriving at a result that didn't fit any available model. That's not normal, Quan said. He said it without judgment, simply as an observation. The kind of thing you say when you've run out of other ways to articulate the gap between what you expected and what you're looking at. No, Rowan said. She said it without apology, without pride, without any effect at all. It's not. Briggs was watching all of this with the part of her brain she could never fully switch off, the part that processed information professionally, that looked at the components of a situation and tried to understand what kind of larger structure they were components of. A 17-year-old girl with scores that invalidated the scoring architecture. A father who died in an operation whose details didn't hold up to scrutiny. A classified program whose edges she had found on her own before the program found her. The most sophisticated training simulators Briggs had seen in 6 years of working adjacent to black-budget programs. Deployed specifically for tonight at a facility whose sensor placement she had apparently already known before arriving. And Rourke. Standing at the back of the room all evening with sealed orders and a face that gave nothing, watching Rowan the way you watch a thing you have invested in, not clinically, but with the specific attention of someone who has committed resources to an outcome and is monitoring the return. Someone built that scenario for tonight. She had thought it in the nest, and she had filed it, and she was thinking it again now with more context, and it still didn't resolve cleanly. Because the question wasn't just who had built it. The question was what it was for. An evaluation? That was the official frame. But evaluations tested known capability against known standards. They didn't deploy thermal-emitting motorized simulators with realistic tactical behavior patterns and facility-specific sensor knowledge at a proving ground on Christmas Eve. Demonstrations did. Demonstrations were built for audiences. And if tonight had been a demonstration, if Rowan's scores and her field engagement and the controlled perfect 3-shot elimination of 3 moving simulated threats in the dark had all been performance rather than test, then the question that mattered wasn't whether she had passed. It was who had been watching, and why now? Briggs turned this over in her mind and said nothing, because the mess tent was warm and the coffee was hot, and a 17-year-old girl who was exhausted and cold and carrying more than she should ever have had to carry was, for the first time all evening, sitting in a room full of people who were not evaluating her. That felt, Briggs thought, like something that should be allowed to exist for a few hours before she introduced more complications. Mason refilled Rowan's coffee without asking. She looked at the mug, then at him, with that expression again, the one that arrived when she was given something she didn't know how to classify. Something ordinary and small that had been calibrated to communicate something larger. "It's just coffee," he said. "I know," she said. But she wrapped both hands around the mug and held it, and the warmth went through the cold of her palms and she let it. The mess tent maintained itself around them. Someone found the old radio on the shelf and turned it to a station out of Reno that was playing instrumental holiday music. Real music, not the degraded recording from the duty shack, clear and slightly loud and impractical in its cheerfulness. Torres made a noise that was ambiguously protest and acceptance. Hendricks cut another round of pie slices. Quan put his boots up on an empty chair and was told to take them down by Devlin, who was sitting in that chair and had simply not yet arrived. Rowan sat at the table and drank her coffee, and for a period that lasted perhaps 20 minutes inside the larger machinery of what this night was and what it meant and where it was taking her, she was simply a person in a warm room with other people, not a candidate, not a score, not a demonstration, not a weapon proving its calibration, just a person. It lasted until the radio on Vale's belt. Different from the field radio, this one direct line to the operations center at the facility's administration building, transmitted a double click followed by a long, single tone. priority traffic. Vale was at the doorway of the mess tent in 2 steps. She pressed her earpiece in, listened for 3 seconds, and her posture underwent the change that posture undergoes when information arrives that rewrites the current situation. She looked at Mason. "We have a problem," she said. Mason stood up. "Talk." "The transport that was scheduled for 0500 has been moved." She paused. "And there's a secondary contact report from the Regional Operations Center. Someone's been running surveillance on this facility for the past 72 hours. Her eyes went to Rowan. "They're looking for the candidate." The mess tent went absolutely still. The holiday music played on from the shelf radio, indifferent and bright. 3 chords of something that, in any other context, would have been pleasant. Rowan set her coffee mug down on the table. Her face had completed its transition back. The layer she had relaxed was in place again, the operational frame fully reinstalled, the thing underneath it folded away somewhere internal and load-bearing where it would keep doing its job without being visible. She looked at Vale. "How long do we have?" she asked. And her voice was exactly what it had been on the range. Level, precise, carrying 0 wasted energy, already past the reaction and into the calculation. Vale checked her watch. 40 minutes, maybe less. Rowan stood up, picked up the rifle she had set against the wall when she sat down. "Then we should stop sitting," she said. The holiday music kept playing from the shelf radio for exactly 4 more seconds, before Torres crossed the tent in 2 strides and switched it off. The silence that replaced it was a working silence, the kind that has direction and momentum, the kind that precedes coordinated action rather than discussion. Mason was already moving. "Vale, get me everything the Ops Center has on the surveillance contact. Source, duration, vector of interest, any indication of intent." He looked at Devlin. "Full kit, 2 minutes. I want everyone on a defensive posture until we understand what we're looking at." "Copy," Devlin said, and was gone. Hendricks and Torres followed without being told. Quan hesitated for half a second, the hesitation of someone young enough to still need confirmation that what he thought was happening was actually happening. And then, he was gone too. Briggs moved to Vale's side. "What exactly did the Ops Center say?" "Word for word." Vale was already pulling up the direct line feed on her tablet, the screen casting pale light against her face in the dimming warmth of the mess tent. Regional Ops flagged a pattern of vehicle surveillance on the outer access road. 3 separate vehicles, different makes, cycling through the same observation points over a 72-hour window. Not random traffic. The timing intervals and positioning are consistent with a coordinated watch rotation. She paused. They also intercepted a communications fragment, encrypted partial decode. The fragment contains a physical description and a location reference that matches this facility. "The physical description," Briggs said. "Is it Rowan?" Vale looked at Rowan. Rowan was standing at the entrance of the mess tent with the rifle in a low-ready carry. Not threatening, not aggressive. The carry of someone who has integrated the weapon into their posture so completely that it functions as a natural extension of the body rather than an object being held. She was listening to everything and saying nothing, and her face was the face she wore when she was processing a tactical picture. Clear, still, working. "The fragment references a female juvenile asset," Vale said carefully. "Scheduled transfer, high-value extraction." The word extraction sat in the tent like a piece of foreign material. "They're not coming to engage the facility," Mason said. He said it the way you say the thing you've just understood, the thing the data was pointing toward and you needed 1 more second to arrive at. "They're coming to take her." Rowan didn't react to this. She had, Briggs suspected, arrived at the same conclusion approximately 90 seconds ago. She was simply waiting for the room to catch up. "Who are they?" Mason asked. He was looking at Rowan when he asked it. "I don't know," she said, "but I have guesses." "Share them." She looked at him steadily. "My father's operation," she said, "the one that didn't add up. There were people who had reasons not to want the true account of what happened to become accessible to the right people. I've been working on making it accessible." A pause. "Through the program. Through the clearance the program gave me. There's a process, and it's slow, and it's classified, but it exists. And if someone outside the program has learned that I'm close to completing that process..." She stopped. Let the implication complete itself. Mason said, "They'd want to interrupt it, or remove the person driving it," she said. "You're 17 years old," Mason said. Not as a dismissal, as a statement of fact that he was still working through the implications of. "I know how old I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something that Briggs would think about later, in a different context, as one of the most purely decent things she had witnessed a senior NCO do in 6 years of working with military personnel. He didn't express doubt or concern or the reflexive protective instinct that would have been, in its own way, its own form of dismissal. He simply nodded and said, "Okay, then we need Rourke." "Rourke left the compound," Vale said. Mason turned. "What?" 10 minutes after the debrief, his vehicle cleared the outer gate. Vale was reading from her tablet, her voice carrying the flat quality of someone delivering information they find professionally unwelcome. "He left his field radio. It's on the table in the ready room." The tent sat with this for a moment. Devlin was back in the doorway, fully kitted. Chest rig, rifle, sidearm, the gear of someone who has done this enough times that suiting up is faster than most people's morning routine. He looked at Mason's face and read what he found there. "Rourke's gone?" "Gone," Mason said. Devlin's jaw tightened. "Of course he is." "What does that mean?" Quan asked, from behind Devlin in the doorway. "It means," Devlin said, with the measured delivery of someone choosing precision over speed, "that the captain delivered his package, conducted his evaluation, confirmed his results, and exited the operational environment before the complications arrived." He looked at Mason, "which tells you something about how expected the complications were." Mason looked at Rowan. She looked back at him. "Did you know he would leave?" he asked. "I suspected," she said. "Rourke isn't a field asset. He's a program coordinator. His job was to deliver me here, observe the evaluation, and confirm the results to whoever is receiving his report." She paused. "His report is complete. His presence here after this point would either complicate his deniability or create a paper trail he doesn't want." "So he handed you to us," Mason said. "He handed me to the situation," she said. "You're just in the situation." Briggs said carefully, "Rowan, I need to ask you something directly." Rowan looked at her. "Are we in danger because of you, or are we in danger because of what you know?" The distinction, Briggs knew, mattered. People in danger because of who they are can be moved, separated, protected by distance. Information that people want suppressed is different. People who want information suppressed don't always limit their methods to extraction. Rowan took 2 seconds. "Both," she said. "But if they wanted to use force, they've had 72 hours of surveillance to pick a better approach window than 40 minutes before dawn with a full team on the compound." She paused. "They want me intact. They want the access I have to the process I've been building. That limits their options." "It doesn't eliminate them," Briggs said. "No," Rowan said. "It doesn't." Mason made a decision. The kind of decision that happens not through deliberation, but through the accumulation of small decisions that preceded it. Each piece of the evening's data, each observed detail, each moment of recalibration, resolving into a clear and irrevocable direction. "We hold this compound," he said. "We protect the candidate. We get her on that transport when it arrives, and we do not let anyone remove her from this facility before that transport gets here." He looked around at his team, at Devlin and Torres and Hendricks and Quan, at Vale and Briggs, at the assembled capability of a unit that had spent the evening being surprised by a teenager and had responded to that surprise by becoming, collectively, something better than they had been at the start of the night. That's the mission, simple and complete. Anybody unclear on any part of it? Nobody was unclear. "Good," Mason said. "Let's go to work." The compound transformation from mess tent warmth to full defensive posture took 11 minutes, which Mason would later assess as 2 minutes too long given the information they had about the surveillance window. In practice, it was fast. Fast enough that when the outer perimeter motion sensors registered a vehicle on the access road at 0342, the team was in position, the compound was dark, and the only lights visible from outside the wire were the generator tower's holiday blinks, still cycling through their green-red-white pattern with the placid indifference of something that didn't know what kind of night it was participating in. Rowan was in the observation bunker again. Not the sniper nest this time. Too fixed, too elevated, too committed to a single vector. She was on the ground floor at the firing position on the bunker's northwest face, which gave her a clear field of view across the approach road and the outer gate without requiring her to be at altitude. Briggs was with her. They had said very little since taking the position, and the silence between them had the quality of a silence that has found its correct form. Not uncomfortable, not forced, but simply the right response to the current situation. The vehicle on the access road stopped 200 meters outside the outer gate and cut its lights. It sat there for 4 minutes. Inside the main structure, Vale was watching the thermal display. "Single vehicle," she said over the radio. 4 signatures inside, not moving. Mason on the north perimeter. "Copy. Hold all positions." The vehicle stayed dark and still. 4 minutes became 6. 6 became 9. Devlin's voice, dry and flat. "They're reading us." "Or they're waiting for something," Torres said. "Same thing," Devlin said. Mason looked at the access road through his scope. The vehicle was a dark rectangle against the marginally lighter dark of the desert floor. He could see it with his naked eye, but only just, and only because he knew exactly where to look. To anyone who didn't know this terrain, it would be invisible. He had spent enough time in positions like this one, waiting with a scope in the dark for a situation to declare itself, to have developed a calibrated instinct for the specific texture of different kinds of threat. There was the texture of people who intended violence and were committing to it. There was the texture of people who intended violence and were still deciding. And there was the texture of people who had come for something specific and were calculating the cost of taking it. The vehicle outside the wire had the texture of the third category they were calculating, which meant they could be affected by the calculation. He keyed his radio. "Vale, can we light them up?" "Perimeter floods?" Vale said. "Everything," Mason said. "Generator power, flood arrays, all exterior lighting. I want them to see exactly what's waiting for them." A pause. "That also shows them our positions." "It shows them we have positions," Mason said, "which is what I want them to understand." A beat of silence. Then Vale. "Copy. Stand by." When the lights came on, they came on all at once. The perimeter flood arrays washing the outer wire in stark white. The secondary lighting along the access road activating in sequence from the gate outward. The compound's exterior illuminated with the flat precision of a facility that had been designed with the assumption that nighttime operational clarity mattered. The vehicle on the access road was suddenly completely visible. Dark-colored, government pattern, 4 doors, antenna cluster on the roof. The kind of vehicle that was specifically designed to be unremarkable in contexts where unremarkable was an operational requirement, and suddenly bathed in 300,000 lumens of unambiguous intent. For 30 seconds, it didn't move. Then it started its engine. It backed up slowly, not rushing, maintaining a deliberate pace that said we are making a choice, not a retreat, until it reached the first bend in the access road, where it turned and drove away. The team held position for 7 full minutes after the vehicle disappeared. Then Mason called the stand down. The perimeter flood stayed on. Nobody suggested turning them off, and Mason didn't order it, because the message they communicated, "We know you're out there and we are prepared," was worth the generator load for however many hours remained until transport. The compound returned to a modified alert status rather than a full stand-down. A compression of the defensive posture, not an elimination of it. Positions stayed manned, weapons stayed hot, but people could move, and the particular suffocating intensity of a full combat posture maintained for 40 minutes of absolute stillness could release slightly. Mason walked to the observation bunker. He found Rowan and Briggs exactly as he'd left them. In position, in the dark, unhurried. Rowan had not moved in 40 minutes. The rifle was where it had been. Her position was what it had been. The only thing that had changed was a slight reddening at the tips of her fingers where the cold had worked through her gloves over the sustained period, and she was flexing them now, slowly, methodically, restoring circulation with the same patient deliberateness she brought to everything else. "They left," he said. "I saw," she said. "They'll be back." "Maybe." "Not maybe." she said. They didn't come here on a whim. They came here because the timing was specific. The evaluation, the transport window, the staffing pattern. They planned this. When the conditions changed, they withdrew, but the underlying objective didn't change. She looked at him. They'll adjust their approach and try again. Not here, Mason said. Transport in. He checked his watch. 47 minutes. Once you're off this compound, you're in a different security context. I know, she said. Does that concern you? She thought about it. The genuine version of thinking about it, not the performance. Less than it probably should, she said. I've been in a lot of different security contexts, some better than this, some worse. A pause. This one has been better than most. He looked at her. Because of the shooting? Because of the pie, she said. He almost laughed. Not quite. The amusement got to his face and became something less than a laugh, but more than nothing, an expression that cracked the operational surface just briefly. We should go inside, he said. Yes, she said, but she didn't move immediately. She looked out through the bunker's northwest face at the access road, at the empty space where the vehicle had been, at the desert that had swallowed it back up as though it had never arrived. The surveillance team, she said. The 72 hours. She paused. They would have been watching when I arrived. They saw the transport. They know I was here. Yes, Mason said. They'll also know your team was here. The personnel present for tonight's evaluation. She looked at him directly. I want you to understand what that could mean. For the people in this room. He held her gaze. We understand operational risk. This is a specific risk, she said. Related to my specific situation, not the standard kind. She paused. I want you to know that I'm aware of it. Noted, he said. And then because this seemed to be the kind of conversation where the honest thing was also the useful thing. And I want you to know that the people in this room made their choices tonight with full professional judgment, not because they were assigned to you, not because they didn't understand the situation. He paused. Because they saw what you are, and they decided it was worth protecting. The bunker was cold and dark, and completely quiet. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. The thing that moved across her face was not an expression he could name precisely. It was too brief and too layered, a rapid sequence of things she was feeling and containing simultaneously. But at the end of it, what remained was something quieter and more durable than what had been there before. Okay, she said. It was a small word for what it was carrying. They went inside. The ready room had been converted into something between a command post and a waiting room. Vale at her station, running continuous checks on the access road and outer perimeter sensors. Devlin and Torres at the equipment table, doing the specific kind of gear maintenance that was not about the gear, but about having something purposeful to do with your hands. Hendricks at the window. Quan cross-legged on the floor with his back against the wall, apparently actually sleeping, which Mason had always considered one of the most elite skills a soldier could possess. Briggs went directly to the side table and poured coffee. She handed a mug to Rowan without ceremony, and Rowan took it the same way she had taken it in the mess tent, wrapping both hands around it, the warmth doing something visible to her posture, something small and involuntary and human. Devlin looked up from the equipment table. He looked at Rowan. Something had been settling in him over the past hour. Mason could see it, the way you see something settle when a person stops fighting a fact and lets it restructure their understanding instead. I need to ask you something, Devlin said. Rowan looked at him. The wind pre-compensation, the pressure differential read, the sensor placement sequence? He paused. You weren't just well-trained. Those are capabilities that take, I don't know, a particular kind of mind, a particular kind of development. He paused again, choosing words with unusual care. Who did that to you? The question landed in the room. It was, Briggs thought, the right question. Phrased in exactly the right way, not how did you learn, but who did that to you, which was the question that acknowledged what the previous framing had been avoiding, that what had produced Rowan was not simply excellent training applied to a talented individual, but something that had been done to a person who had not had the full agency to choose it. Rowan looked at Devlin for a long time. My father started it, she said finally. He was a precision shooter at a level that most programs don't produce. He believed in early development, not as exploitation, but as investment. He thought the skills he had were worth passing on, and he believed the earlier you started, the more completely they integrated into how you perceived the world, rather than being a layer added on top of it. She paused. He wasn't wrong about that. But, Devlin said, because there was a but in there, sitting in the cadence of how she'd said it. But he died, she said. And the people who came after him had different ideas about what the investment was for. She looked at the middle distance. My father trained me because he wanted me to be capable. The program trains me because it wants me to be useful. Those are related conditions, but they're not the same one. The ready room held this. And you? Mason asked quietly. What do you want? She looked at him. The question seemed to require genuine navigation, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was in a place that she didn't often have cause or permission to access. I want to know what happened to my father, she said. I want the actual account, not the amended one, not the version that protects whoever needed protecting. She paused. I want to know what his last day actually looked like, who he was with, what went wrong, and why. Another pause. And then I want to decide what to do about it. And the program gives you access to that, Briggs said. The program gives me access to the process that might eventually produce that, Rowan said. There's a difference. The process is slow. The access is conditional. The people managing it have their own priorities. She looked at Briggs, which is why people outside the program are motivated to interrupt it. Because if I complete the process, the information I find won't stay inside the program. You'd take it public, Briggs said. I'd take it to the right people, Rowan said, which might be public or might not. But it would leave the sealed room, and whatever it contains about whoever made the decisions that killed my father would become part of a record that could be acted on. She paused. That's what tonight was about. Not the scoring, not the evaluation. The scoring was proof of concept. What tonight was actually demonstrating was whether I'm capable enough to be worth protecting through the completion of that process. The ready room was completely still. Vele, at her station, had stopped typing. Devlin had set down the component he'd been handling. Even Quan, who had either been asleep or performing a very convincing simulation of it, had opened his eyes. Rourke's report, Mason said slowly. Whatever he's sending up the chain tonight, it's not an evaluation record. It's an argument, Rowan said, for resources, for protection, for the program's decision to continue investing in the process. She looked at her hands around the coffee mug. My scores tonight are the evidence for that argument. And the surveillance team, Briggs said, they knew about tonight because someone in the chain told them. Or someone in the chain is them, Rowan said. The implication of that sentence arranged itself in the room like furniture that had always been there, but hadn't been noticed until the light changed. If someone inside the chain of command that oversaw this evaluation had communicated its timing and location to the people running the surveillance, if the leak was not a breach from outside but an operation from within, then Rourke's departure 40 minutes ago carried a different reading than program coordinator completing his function and maintaining deniability. Mason looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Mason. Neither of them said what they were thinking because the room wasn't the right room for it, and the time wasn't the right time, and the 17-year-old girl sitting at the table with cold hands and an empty coffee mug had already carried more of this than anyone her age should have been asked to carry. More coffee? Mason said to her. She looked at the mug, then at him. The expression she made was complicated and brief, and at the end of it she almost smiled again. Got closer than she had in the mess tent, the threshold lower now, the expression almost completing itself before it stopped. Yes, she said. He poured it. At 0447, Vale's station registered the transport. Inbound vehicle, she said. Single truck matching the scheduled transport profile. IFF transponder checks out. She looked at Mason. It's clean. The room stood up collectively, the compressed posture of people who have been in a sustained operational state and can feel the approach of the moment when it ends. Mason looked at Rowan. Time to go. She stood. Set down the mug. Checked the rifle. Safe, cleared. The post-engagement sequence completed one final time with the same flat efficiency she had brought to every equipment check all evening. She looked around the ready room. At the tactical display and the equipment racks and the folding chairs and the Christmas lights visible through the window, still blinking against the pre-dawn dark. She looked at Vale, who nodded. At Torres, who gave her a straight-faced two-finger salute that managed to communicate respect without performing it. At Hendricks, who simply said, "Good shooting," in a voice that meant more than the words. At Quan, who had fully woken up and was looking at her with the open expression of someone who was going to be thinking about this night for a long time. She looked at Devlin. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she shook it, firm, brief, the handshake of two professionals who have arrived at a mutual assessment through adversarial means and found it satisfactory. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," she said. She looked at Briggs last. Briggs, who had asked her the real questions. Briggs, who had been in the nest with her and had heard the breathing and had understood what it meant and had filed it without weaponizing it. Briggs crossed the room and did something that surprised everyone in it, including probably herself. She put her hand briefly on Rowan's shoulder. Not a grip, not a formal gesture. The simple placement of a hand on another person's shoulder, which communicated, in its smallness and its directness, something that had no better form. Rowan went very still for 1 second. Then she put her hand over Briggs's. 1 second, just one, the duration of a breath, and took it away. She picked up her pack and walked to the door. Mason fell in to step beside her. They crossed the compound in the pre-dawn dark, the perimeter flood still running, the cold still complete, the desert floor frozen solid underfoot. The transport was pulling through the outer gate, headlights cutting the access road, engine running with the steady purpose of a vehicle that knew where it was going. They walked in silence. Then Rowan said, "Mason." He looked at her. "When the report from tonight goes up the chain." She paused. "Whatever it says, whatever Rourke's argument is, however this gets framed." Another pause. "Your team did the right thing tonight. All of them, including the parts that weren't in the evaluation brief." "They did," he said. "Make sure that's in your version of the report." He looked at her. "My version?" "You'll write one," she said. "You're the kind of officer who writes the version that says what actually happened." She met his eyes. "Make sure the team is in it." He held her gaze for a moment. "Done," he said. The transport stopped. The rear door opened. A figure in the cab, driver, no visible rank insignia, the particular anonymity of program-adjacent personnel, waited without looking at them. Rowan stood at the rear of the transport for a moment. She reached into her jacket pocket and touched the photograph. Not taking it out, just confirming it was there, the way you confirm the presence of something load-bearing before you move. She looked at Mason one final time. In the pre-dawn light, with the floods behind him and the desert dark ahead, she looked, for just that moment, just that fraction of the light, exactly as old as she was. 17. A person who should have been somewhere warm and ordinary, navigating the ordinary complications of an ordinary life. Then she climbed into the transport. The door closed. The vehicle pulled forward, turned at the outer gate, and moved down the access road into the desert dark. Mason stood at the perimeter and watched its lights until the first bend took them. The compound was quiet. The floods ran. The generator tower blinked its patient holiday pattern against the beginning of a sky that was just, at the very eastern edge, starting to consider the possibility of dawn. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside to write his report. The ready room was very quiet when Mason came back inside. The team was still there. None of them had gone to their bunks, which told him something about what the night had done to them, about the particular kind of wakefulness that comes not from caffeine or duty, but from having been changed by something and not yet knowing what to do with the change. Torres was at the side table. Devlin had his chair turned to face the window. Vale was still at her station, running down the last of the night's sensor logs with the methodical patience of someone who needed the familiar structure of a task to decompress through. Briggs was writing. Not on her tablet. In a physical notebook, the small, hard-bound kind she carried in her left cargo pocket, the one whose existence she had never explained to anyone, and which no one had asked about because the unspoken consensus was that Briggs's notebook was Briggs's business. She was writing in it now, with focused attention, the pen moving steadily across the page, and she did not look up when Mason came in. He sat down at the desk in the corner, the one with the old desktop terminal and the stack of forms that needed to be filled out in triplicate for the range usage log and the equipment accountability report and all the other administrative machinery that continued turning regardless of what the night had contained. He opened a blank document. He sat with it for a moment. Then he began to type. The report was not what Rourke would have written. Mason knew that before he'd typed the second paragraph. Rourke's version would be clean and vertical. Performance metrics, evaluation outcomes, candidate assessment, numbers and categories. The language of a process arriving at a conclusion. It would be complete within its own frame and would say almost nothing about what had actually happened in this facility between 2300 and 0447 on Christmas Eve. Mason's version was different. He wrote it the way he wrote all his operational reports, from the ground up, in the sequence that the information had arrived, with the details that the standard form didn't have fields for. He wrote about the evaluation and the scores, because those were required. He wrote about the perimeter breach, the surveillance vehicle, the thermal simulators, the stand-down. He wrote about the team's response time and positioning and the decision to flood the perimeter. He wrote those things because they were operational facts, and operational facts belonged in operational reports. And then he wrote the other things. He wrote about the quality of the candidate's decision-making under sustained pressure, about the atmospheric read and the pre-compensated wind hold, about the moment in the sniper nest when Briggs had called 3 static signatures and the compound had gone quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something has been completed that matters. He wrote about the photograph, not the details of it, that was hers, not his, but the fact of it, and what it communicated about the person carrying it, and the weight she had been carrying it under. He wrote, "This candidate has been shaped by a program that has optimized her capability at the expense of her context. She is operationally exceptional in ways that this evaluation's standard metrics are not designed to capture. She is also 17 years old, and the people responsible for her development have confused those two facts in ways that will eventually cost the program something it cannot recover." He stared at that sentence for a moment. Then he left it in. He kept writing. It was Devlin who spoke first from his chair by the window. "You think she'll be all right?" he said. The question was directed at the room generally, which was the way Devlin asked questions he wasn't sure he wanted a direct answer to. "Define all right," Torres said. "Safe," Devlin said. Devlin. "From whoever was in that vehicle." "She'll be in a different security context," Vale said, not looking up from her station. "Transport protocol changes her exposure profile significantly. If the surveillance team was working this specific location for this specific window, they lose their operational advantage once she's mobile and routed through the program's infrastructure." "That's the tactical answer," Devlin said. "Yes," Vale said. "I was asking the other one." The room sat with that. The other answer, the one about whether a 17-year-old girl who had been built into a weapon by a program that needed one, who was carrying a dead father and an unanswered question, and a photograph of a day that was the last good day before everything became something else, would be all right in the sense that Devlin meant that answer was more complicated than anyone in the room was going to be able to produce at 0510 on Christmas morning. "She's tough," Quan said. He said it with the directness of someone who hasn't yet developed the habit of hedging things that seem true. "Tough isn't the same as all right," Briggs said. She said it without looking up from her notebook. "Tough is what you become, so you can keep going. All right is something else." Devlin turned from the window. He looked at Briggs for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I meant." Nobody else said anything, and the not saying was its own kind of answer. The collective acknowledgement that some questions have to be held rather than resolved, that some nights leave you with things you carry forward instead of things you put down. Mason kept writing. He finished the report at 0531. He read it through once, changed 2 sentences, and submitted it through the secure channel to the operational oversight address that Rourke's orders had specified. The system confirmed receipt. He printed 1 copy, signed it, and put it in the duty log with the night's sensor records and range data. Then he printed a 2nd copy. He didn't submit the 2nd copy anywhere. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, inside the breast pocket, against the left side of his chest. Not because he thought he would need it, not immediately, not specifically, but because the night had taught him something about the gap between official records and true ones, and about the cost of letting that gap go unaddressed. And he had decided, somewhere in the hours between Rowan's first shot and her last look at him from the transport door, that he was not going to be someone who let that gap widen. He was not going to be Rourke. That was the decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It was the kind of decision that looks, from the outside, like simply doing your job correctly. But Mason understood the difference between doing your job correctly and choosing to do your job correctly when the alternative was easier and better protected, and would cost you nothing except the thing you saw when you looked in certain directions. He made the choice. He put the copy in his pocket. He closed the terminal. He stood up and looked at the room, at his team, in the particular dishevelment of the very end of a very long night, at the blinking light still visible through the window, at the coffee that had been cycling through the machine on the counter since 2300 and now tasted like the memory of coffee rather than the thing itself. "Merry Christmas," he said. It landed strangely. Too flat, too ordinary, the wrong key for the room's current emotional register. And then Torres laughed, a real laugh, short and startled, the laugh of someone who has been carrying too much tension for too many hours and has found an unexpected release valve. And that laugh opened something in the room, and Quan made a sound that was its echo, and even Devlin's mouth shifted in a way that did not become a smile but was the structural precursor of one. The room breathed. "Get some sleep," Mason said. "All of you." He went to the window and looked out at the compound. The perimeter floods were still running, turning the frozen hardpan into a pale, flat field of white light that ended at the wire and then became dark desert again. The generator tower blinked, green, red, white. The same cycle it had been running all night, the same indifferent cheerfulness, unchanged by anything the night had contained. He thought about Rowan's hands around the coffee mug. He thought about, "I don't remember a time when I wasn't doing this." He thought about the photograph and the laughing man in mountain country, and the daughter who had become exceptional in ways that had cost her the right to be ordinary first. He stood there for a while. Then he went to check the perimeter one last time, the way you check a thing, not because you think you'll find anything different, but because the habit of checking is how you've gotten through every other night like this one, and you trust the habit more than you trust the feeling that everything is probably fine. Everything was probably fine. He checked anyway. 3 weeks later, Mason received a package. No return address. Postmarked from a processing facility in the Pacific Northwest that he recognized as one of the routing addresses used by program-adjacent personnel who needed to move physical correspondence without a direct origin trail. The package was small. Padded envelope, his name, and the facility address in plain block letters, nothing identifying on the outside. Inside was a piece of fabric, a patch, roughly 3 inches across, irregular in shape because it had been cut by hand rather than manufactured, from what appeared to be a piece of olive drab field jacket material, the same weight and color as the jacket Rowan had been wearing that night. Onto it, someone had stitched in tight, careful thread, black thread, neat stitching, the kind of needlework that takes time and precision, a simple design, a silhouette of a mountain range, and below it, a single star. No name, no unit designation, no date, just the mountain range and the star, and the knowledge of whose hands had made it, and when, and out of what. Mason held it for a long time. He was sitting at the desk in his quarters, off shift, civilian clothes, the particular quietness of a morning with nowhere he needed to be immediately. And he turned the patch over in his hands and looked at the stitching and thought about the quality of attention that had gone into it. The same quality of attention that went into everything she did, precise, complete, nothing wasted. He put it on his desk and went to the small kitchen and made coffee and brought it back and sat with both things, the coffee and the patch, in the morning light. His phone was on the desk. He looked at it, then picked it up and sent a message to the group contact he had created for the team after Christmas, the one titled simply Raven Ridge with no other annotation. He took a photo of the patch and sent it without text. The responses came back over the next 20 minutes. Quan, 3 question marks, then, is that what I think it is? Torres, nothing for 4 minutes, then a single word, damn Hendricks, she made that herself. Vale, mountain range, Cascades. That's where she's from. Devlin's response took the longest, 9 minutes. When it came, it was, "Keep it somewhere good." Briggs responded last, which was consistent with how Briggs did most things, after everyone else, with more precision. She sent 2 words. "She's okay." Mason looked at those 2 words for a long time. He didn't know what Briggs's source was. He didn't ask. Briggs had spent 20 years developing networks of information that she managed in her notebook and her memory and nowhere else. And if Briggs said she's okay in response to a photograph of a handmade patch, then she had a basis for saying it that was worth more than speculation. He put the patch in the breast pocket of his field jacket, left side. Same place he'd put the report copy. He kept it there. 6 weeks after Christmas, the operational oversight address that Mason had submitted his report to generated a response. Not to his report directly. The report had been acknowledged and filed, and would remain in whatever archive received documents at its classification level. The response was a separate communication, routed through the standard chain, and it arrived as a formal notification rather than correspondence. An internal review had been opened. The subject of the review was a classified program whose designation was not stated in the notification. The basis for the review was described as anomalous operational procedures and reporting discrepancies identified during a December evaluation. The reviewing authority was an oversight body that Mason recognized by its letterhead, a body that sat above the standard chain of command at a level that required specific political authorization to convene. That level of oversight body did not open reviews based on routine reporting discrepancies. It opened them when someone, somewhere, had given it a reason to look at something it would otherwise never have seen. Mason read the notification twice. Then he filed it in the duty log, where it belonged, next to the original report. He did not tell Rourke about it. He had not spoken to Rourke since Christmas Eve. He had no plans to. 2 months after the notification arrived, Mason received a second package from the Pacific Northwest routing address. This one contained a letter. 1 page, handwritten, the same precise block letters as the patch's address label. Functional, not stylized, the writing of someone who had been taught to write legibly for operational purposes and had never developed the decorative habits of someone who wrote for pleasure. It began without a salutation. The process is complete. The actual account is now part of a record that will be acted on. I don't know what acting on it will look like, or how long it will take, or whether I'll be present for the outcome. But the information is out of the sealed room. That was the thing that needed to happen. My father's last day was what I suspected it was. The operation was real. The accident designation was a cover for a decision made by people who had the authority to make it and the ability to bury it. Those people are named in the record now. Some of them are still in positions that the naming will affect. I'm telling you this because you wrote the report that gave the oversight body a reason to look. I know that's what happened. I know what it cost to write it the way you wrote it. The team should know that it mattered. I'm somewhere different now. The program has changed. Some of the people managing it have changed. And the work I'm doing is different. Still the same kind of work. I don't know how to do other kinds yet, but I'm trying to learn. The pie was the best thing I ate for a long time after that night. I thought you should know. It ended there. No signature, no contact information, no indication of where she was or where she was going. Just the 1 page, the careful handwriting, and the last line about the pie that had done something to Mason's chest the moment he read it. Something that was not grief, not exactly, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of understanding something at its correct scale for the first time. He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he photographed it and sent it to the group contact. The responses, again, came one by one. Juan went quiet for a while and then wrote something about how he was going to be thinking about this for years. Torres said nothing, which was Torres's way of saying what he meant more completely than words. Hendricks typed good and meant it with everything. Vale asked no questions, which was how Vale expressed that she had already put the picture together, and the picture was what she had hoped. Devlin, tell her the team says the same. Briggs, nothing for 3 hours. Then, she said she's learning to do other kinds of work. That means she's in a place where someone gave her space to try. That's the thing that mattered most. Mason read that and thought about Briggs's hand on Rowan's shoulder and Rowan's hand on Briggs's, and the 1 second that had lasted just long enough to carry what it needed to carry. He folded the letter, put it in his breast pocket with the patch and the report copy. a collection of things that didn't belong in any official archive, that lived in the left side of his jacket against his chest, because that was where you kept the things that reminded you why the work was worth doing. He stood at the window of his quarters and looked out at the base. The ordinary, flat, unclassified landscape of a regular facility on a regular morning, nothing blinking in the dark, no desert hardpan, no frozen ground. He thought about a girl standing in the cold Nevada night with a rifle and a photograph and a question she had been carrying since she was 13 years old. He thought about the answer she had gotten. He thought about what it had cost her to get it, and what it had cost the people who had tried to prevent her, and about the specific quality of justice available to people who are very patient and very precise and willing to wait as long as necessary for the right moment, the right position, the right conditions. Then he thought about what she'd said about the pie, and something in him that had been holding itself at operational tension for 2 months let go slightly. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. He made coffee. He drank it by the window in the morning light and thought about people who become legends in silence, and about what legends cost, and about the single irreducible fact that underneath every capability and every score and every performance that invalidates the scale, there is still a person. That person deserves someone who remembers. That person deserves a moment of warmth. That person deserves, at minimum, one night in a warm room with people who see them, not the weapon, not the asset, not the capability, but the actual human being carrying all of it. And sometimes, Mason thought, that is enough to make a difference. Not enough to fix everything. Not enough to undo the years before or change the shape of the work ahead. Not enough to return what was taken or restore what was lost. But enough to plant something in a person that survives the cold and the distance and the long machine of the program and the silence of the sealed rooms. Enough that months later, on an ordinary morning in a different place, that person sits down and writes a letter about pie, and means everything by it. Some people are forged by forces they did not choose, in fires they did not light, and they burn so cleanly that the world mistakes their endurance for the absence of pain. But the bravest thing a person can do, after surviving everything that was done to them, is choose, even once, even briefly, to still be human. That choice is not weakness. That choice is the whole point.